So our last snippet for this week looks at constitutional history from 37 until the U.S. entry into World War I, and there really kind of two major themes here. The first is what happens in the aftermath of the court packing plan, and the second is again foreign policy issues, executive, legislative, in the run up to World War II. As Congress was considering court packing, the two centrist or center-right justices on the court, Chief Justice Hughes and this man, Justice Owen Roberts, basically switch sides on the contentious votes and suddenly decide that they're going to uphold most key Roosevelt policies. Roberts, after his death, orders his wife to destroy all of his private papers, and so we don't really have a clear sense of why Roberts made the changes that he did. I mean, it's possible he was just sort of open-minded and got to change his approach. It's also possible he was acting kind of under a sense of political pressure, of fear that if he didn't uphold the Supreme Court, there might be court packing, which would cause real problems in terms of the institutional heft of the court. But whatever his reason, he starts voting in favor of the Supreme Court's of the New Deal's constitutionality in the Supreme Court in 1937. And the first of these cases is a case called West Coast Hotel versus Parrish, which upholds a federal minimum wage law and says the Constitution does not speak of freedom of contract. So it strikes down the Atkins decision. Remember, that was from the 1920s. The Atkins decision had struck down this federal minimum wage law for women. West Coast Hotel says that decision was incorrect, and there were in the aftermath of this a series of decisions which uphold the Wagner Act, which uphold the Social Security Act, and which effectively reverse the kind of Lochner principles from the early 20th century. And one of the conservative justices, has sort of senses that what way the winds are blowing and announces his retirement, and eventually all of the conservative justices will do so. They sense they no longer have any power. There's one other court decision that I wanted to mention during this time, not because it's significant in and of itself, but for this so-called footnote 4. And that's a case called the United States versus Caroline Products. And in this decision, the court says, again, this is, we're still in this 5-4 era. The court says that laws passed by Congress dealing with economic regulation issues carry a presumption of constitutionality. That is, the court's job is to assume that they're constitutional, and unless there's a clear reason to strike it down, it should be upheld. But the court argues that in a footnote, which comes to be known as footnote 4, that a more searching view of whether a statute is constitutional applies. When legislation is directed at particular religious or national or racial minorities to determine whether prejudice against discrete and insular minorities may be a special contention, which may call for a correspondingly more searching judicial inquiry. And this is a principle that comes to be known as strict scrutiny. And when courts apply strict scrutiny to a federal or state statute, they're far more likely to strike it down. So in Caroline Products, it's an economic issue. The court upholds the law, but this principle is going to become a big principle to understanding post-World War II constitutional affairs. By the time he leaves office, Roosevelt will have appointed 8 of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court. Quite liberal group of figures. Hugo Black, Alabama senator, quite liberal New Dealer, who will serve on the court until the early 1970s. Justice Robert Jackson, Roosevelt's former attorney general, stout defender of the New Deal, stout defender of individual liberties. always has as well. William Douglas, a Yale law professor, had gone to work for Roosevelt and is probably the most liberal member of the court, or one of the two most liberal members of the court by the 1940s to 1950s. He too will serve. He serves until 1975. Justice Frank Murphy, former governor of Michigan, very strong defender of individual liberties, concerned with racism, sees the courts as having a special role to stand up against racism. And Felix Frankfurter, former Harvard law professor who had been a Roosevelt advisor, who drifts to the right as he serves under the court in the 50s and 60s, but is a strong defender of the New Deal. So basically, Roosevelt doesn't get his court packing plan, but ultimately does name the justices on the court anyway, because he's just in office for such a long time. Now, the other big constitutional issue in the run-up to World War II is this sense that Congress should act to prevent the president from pulling the U.S. into the war in the way that a lot of anti-interventionist members believe that Wilson did with World War I. And the backdrop here is that the Depression creates a sense in the United States, in universities, among popular opinion, in Congress, that the U.S. intervention in World War I was a mistake and must be avoided as Europe sort of marches towards war in the 1930s. There's a congressional investigation looking at the U.S. involvement into World War I, which is chaired by this man, Gerald Nye, who was a Republican senator from North Dakota, but a left-wing senator. And the Nye committee concludes that the U.S. entered the war not really for strategic purposes, but because Wilson was pressured by bankers, by arms manufacturers who had a financial stake in the Allies winning the war. And it's this atmosphere that leads to the passage in 1935 of the Neutrality Act, which places an embargo on all war materiel between the United States and a war zone, and declares that American citizens who travel on ships of warring countries are traveling at their own risk. The backdrop, you think of what happened with regards to U.S. In World War I, the sinking of the Lusitania inflamed sentiments against the Germans, and the sinking of U.S. ships that were providing goods and war material to the Allies ultimately brings the U.S. into the war. So basically, what the Neutrality Act is saying, once there's a war in Europe, U.S. trade has to cease with the warring powers, and if Americans want to travel to the war zone, they're on their own if they get killed. Ironically, the first time that the Neutrality Act will be invoked is not with regards to Europe at all, but instead in this strange 1930s war in South America called the Chaco War, which is fought between Bolivia and Paraguay over a disputed region of Paraguay called the Chaco, where it was thought there were significant oil deposits. It turns out there was not. Roosevelt invokes the Neutrality Act not because he's thrilled at this intrusion on what he sees as political power, but because he wants to. He's hoping he might use it as a precedent to just sort of act against Germany in Europe. And an arms manufacturer called the Curtiss Wright Corporation challenges Roosevelt's invocation. They say that they want to be able to sell arms to the Bolivians, and that it's inappropriate to have a law that prevents them from doing so. And in 1936, in a case called U.S. versus Curtiss Wright, the Supreme Court, by a 9-0 margin, again, this is not a court that really likes FDR, says that the Neutrality Act is constitutional and that the president's power to invoke it is critical. And the key passage here, which I have bolded in red, is that this court holds the president alone has the power to speak or listen as a representative of the nation. He makes treaties by some consent of the Senate, but he alone negotiates. Into the field of negotiation, the Senate cannot intrude, and Congress itself is powerless to invade it. This is a robust declaration of presidential power in foreign affairs. And this is a passage that, as we're going to see, gets repeatedly invoked in international matters after World War II. And Roosevelt, in the run-up to war, keeps pushing the envelope in terms of the U.S. intervening on the side of the Allies. He correctly understands, I think really better than any other world leader but Churchill, just how dangerous Hitler is and just how catastrophic a Hitler victory would be to U.S. national interest. His goal is to supply the British and frankly any country that's fighting the Axis with U.S. war material until the U.S. inevitably enters the war. The most significant of these measures is something called the Lend-Lease Law, where the U.S. Supplies what we would now call military aid to the British, to the Soviets after the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, to the Australians, and in small amounts to the Chinese. This initiative, though, it triggers very strong opposition. U.S. polling is rudimentary during this time, but there's a sense that the Americans both very, very much want the British to win the war, but very, very much do not want the United States fighting in the war. And the lead up interest group opposing this is a group called the America First Committee, which is headed by Charles Lindbergh, the son of a left-wing congressman from Minnesota, an opponent of World War I, who then becomes a famous aviator during the 1920s, and by the 30s moves really quite a bit to the right. There are uncomfortable tinges between the America First Committee and sort of far right thought. But Lindbergh is, he's a celebrity. He's an effective orator. There's until the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, there's quite strong hostility to the U.S. actually intervening in World War II, even though, again, Roosevelt pushes it more closely. And in this environment, there is a proposal to deal with what would have been a radical change in the American Constitution. It's a constitutional amendment proposed by this man, Lewis Ludlow, who was a Republican congressman from Indiana, that called for a war referendum. So before the United States would enter a war, unless the U.S. was attacked, before the U.S. would enter a war, there would be a popular vote on whether or not entering the war was appropriate. So basically taking the war-making power away from Congress and the president and giving it to the people. Now, I mean, you can imagine this was not a practical idea in the modern world, and the amendment never gets majority support in either house of Congress. It never even gets sent to the states for ratification. But there are these efforts to try to restrain the president's power in international affairs from anti-interventionist forces who are worried that Roosevelt is sort of carrying the U.S. into the war in a way that exceeds his constitutional authority. And there was something to this line of argument. So that's what we have for Stippets for this week. I will see everyone this week in discussion.